Hey, Clayton, in Leviticus 21, God tells Moses that he will not allow anyone who is blind, paralyzed, or has any kind of physical defect to come before him. This seems to discriminate against people with disabilities and does not reflect the inclusivity of Jesus. It's a really good question. This is a question I actually kind of bumped on here when I read this passage in our reading. Let me read you the passage and see if you sense the same thing here, okay? Leviticus 21, starting in verse 16, says this. The Lord said to Moses, "Say to Aaron, for the generations to come, none of your descendants who has a defect may come near to offer the food of his God. No man who has a defect may come near. No man who is blind or lame, disfigured or deformed. No man with a crippled foot or hand, or who is a hunchback or a dwarf, or who has an eye defect, or who has a festering or running sore or damaged testicles. No descendant of Aaron the priest who has any defect is to come near to present food offerings to the Lord. If he has a defect, he must not come near to offer food offering to his God. He may eat the most holy food of his God, as well as the holy food, yet because of his defect, he must not go near the curtain or approach the altar and so desecrate my sanctuary. I am the Lord who makes them holy." Did you feel that? As I was reading that, did you get that sense of like, oh man, this seems exclusive, like God is pushing people away, like he doesn't want people based on their physical condition to come near to him, and it feels like this is ableist, to be honest. It sort of sounds like God is excluding people from things that we would say, man, that shouldn't be a reason to be disqualified. So we got to think this through. Okay, the first thing I want to address is the language here. Okay, one of our challenges is that when we're translating the Bible, it wasn't written in English, and so this was written in Hebrew. You've got to ask the question: what words in English today make the most sense out of the words in Hebrew that were there? And when it comes to language around disability, the language is ever evolving. This has been going on for decades, really centuries, where certain terms for different conditions will come in and out of being appropriate, right? Part of what happens is when terms for different conditions come into fashion and they're used in an appropriate way, over time they can actually become used in a derogatory way. People start to use them and speak in a derisive way about those things. And so oftentimes people will say, here's a better way, more respectful way to speak about a person who has that particular condition. And so right now, the most common way of saying, here's how we speak respectfully is what we call person first language. It's saying you start with the phrase, a person who is blind, and you describe the person as a human being, and it gives dignity and respect of saying this person is not simply the condition that they have, this person is a human being. And so this is what is currently most commonly used. And so the translation that we're reading from is a number of years old, which means that the language that they use is not necessarily the most up-to-date language, which means probably in the future, future translations will update that to make it fit whatever is making the most sense at that time. But the reality is, if the language keeps evolving, it's going to be always a little bit behind, and that's just going to be the case. But it doesn't necessarily say something about what the Bible is saying about people who have those conditions. But then there's the substance of the matter, right? It's not just the language. It's the question, why would God exclude people from his presence based on a physical trait like this, and especially exclude someone who has a disability? The first thing to note about this is to note this is a passage that is about priests. This is not a passage about ordinary Israelites. This is about who is allowed to do the work of a priest in the tabernacle. So it's a very specific subset of people, okay? So you got to ask the question, even before you get to this passage, who is allowed to be a priest? Well, only Israelites are allowed to be priests. Only Israelites from the tribe of Levi are allowed to be priests. Only Levites who are from the family of Aaron are allowed to be priests. Only people from the tribe of Aaron who went through the right ceremonies. Only those who are selected to serve at a given time. This is a very limited number of people at any given time. We're not talking about thousands or millions of people. We're talking about dozens of people. And the reason the group of people was kept limited, and the reason there were strict limitations on things that could happen here, is because you got to understand what the tabernacle was. The tabernacle was the place of God's presence, and in many ways, it was meant to recreate something about the state of Eden, right? Think about the beginning of the Bible, when God is in the presence of his people perfectly right there, Adam and Eve have access to him in the Garden of Eden. The tabernacle is not just some arbitrary place. It is the place where God is saying, I'm bringing back, in a world broken by sin and suffering and death, I'm bringing back a little pocket of Eden, a little place that was like the way the world was meant to be. And so as much as possible, God is trying to show the wholeness, the fullness of life that the world originally had and one day will have again. And so one day, every moral defect and every physical defect will be obliterated. The world will be morally and physically perfect. Now, obviously, there is a limit to how close you can get to that reality in this world. But God said this is going to be a space where, as much as you can, you're going to symbolize what this is going to be like. And the priests in particular are meant to represent what humanity in its full and glorious and healed and purified state should look like. And so anything that signified not just sin, but the effects of sin was excluded from the tabernacle, excluded from these holy places. Now, this idea was not something that said something about the status of someone with a disability in society, okay? I want you to notice this, okay? This is a detail in this passage that is actually pretty notable. It didn't say that a person with one of these conditions was excluded completely from being a part of this ceremony, because it actually says this: he may eat the most holy food of his God as well as the holy food. Think about this. This is the food that was offered there in the sacrifices that was then given to the priests to be their food for eating, and that was food that only the priests could eat, and they would eat it right there in the courtyard of the tabernacle. It wasn't in the holy place, the inner sanctuary, but it was in a place where most Israelites could go, and in particular, they were eating with priests because they were part of the priestly family. They simply couldn't go and approach the altar or go into the holy place. So that tells you that there's more going on here than just saying, I don't want you around, okay? The other thing to know is this: there are laws throughout the Torah that are advocating for the dignity, value, worth, and respect for people with disabilities. And this would have been different from societies around them. So, for example, Leviticus chapter 19, verse 14 says this: do not curse the deaf or put a stumbling block in front of the blind, but fear your God, I am the Lord. In other words, if you do something to take advantage of somebody because of their disability, you shouldn't be worried about what they're going to do back to you. You should be worried about what God's going to do, that God's going to defend that person that you might otherwise take advantage of or put down. How about this? Deuteronomy 27:19 says, cursed is anyone who leads a blind person astray on the road. Actually, this is what's going on. This is the scene in Deuteronomy 27. The people of Israel are gathered together, and they are told, okay, you are going to declare blessings and curses on yourself if you keep or violate the laws of God. And one of the curses that the entire people was supposed to say was this: cursed is anyone who leads a blind person astray on the road. And then it says, and then all the people shall say, Amen. Which means the entire country has to affirm that if they mislead, take advantage of somebody who has a disability, that they say, God, you should curse me. And so there was built into Israelite society, Israelite law, defenses to make sure that in that world that people were not taking advantage of people who had disabilities. Another thing to consider is this: why do we as a society value people no matter what their abilities are? You ever thought about that? Like where that value came from? That is not something that has cropped up in every culture, in every time and place. That's actually something that is pretty unique over the course of human history. Where does that value come from? Why do we say it does not matter what your physical abilities are? You have dignity, you have value, you have worth, and we are going to defend that. Where does it come from? It comes from the Bible. That's where we learned it. That's where our culture learned it. It's the influence of the Christian vision of what a human being is. The idea that people are made in the image of God, that people have been given dignity and value because Jesus came for each person. All of these things have made us say we cannot denigrate any person, and we will defend the dignity even of those who in many societies automatically are mistreated or misused or are cast aside. And so we will not be those sorts of people because we are people who believe the Bible. And so there's always something, when you come across something in the Bible and you say, this kind of grates against my modern moral sensibilities, my modern ethical sensibilities, you've got to ask the question, where did those morals and where do those ethics come from? Because sometimes what we're doing is we're saying, I learned something from the Bible, and then I'm going back to the Bible to scold the Bible. And what you really need to say is, wait a minute. If this is where that value comes from, I wonder if on deeper thought, there's a way that this thing that I think is out of sync with it actually is in harmony with what we're talking about. Here's another thing to think about. I want you to ask the question, who is our high priest now? Who's the person who goes into the presence of God and offers the sacrifice and makes sure that we can be cleansed and presents our prayers and our offerings to the Lord? Who is that? Well, it's Jesus, right? It's Jesus, the one who came to earth. God in the flesh showed up, and he met and he dignified people with different needs and different abilities. He said, people with disabilities are not going to be kept at arm's length from me. In fact, when the incarnation of God shows up, when God in his most potent presence shows up, he welcomed people who are blind and deaf and paralyzed. He said, you're not just welcome in my presence, I'm going to welcome you into my very arms. They touched the person of God. Think about Jesus, our high priest, whose body was broken and put back together again, but who still bears the scars of his brokenness. Jesus, the one whose body was raised, but who will also raise our bodies to make them like his, whole and glorified. Who is the one who represents us? It's this Jesus, and it's because of him that all of us, no matter what our bodies are like, no matter what our abilities are, we have dignity and value and worth, and we look to him, the one who knows what it's like and has drawn near to all of us. Thanks for listening. If you've got your own questions, email questions@BibleSavvy.com. Like and subscribe to catch our regular episodes every Monday on the Bible Savvy Podcast.